The subject, and I've already given Dawn the title for this afternoon, is With Liberty and Justice for All, the obvious conclusion of the Pledge of Allegiance. And there are several aspects of that pledge that are remarkably ironic, and I wanted to focus on a few of those aspects today. Here's my list. Some of these are films, others are not. Paul Manafort has been convicted of major bank fraud. He was a collateral victim of the Russiagate investigation of Donald Trump, and he was sentenced to 47 months, which is 1 month short of 4 years. Now, Paul Manafort wears a white shirt and has a very good income, and I want to point out that this article is about a child who is now a man. He's 18 years old, but this photograph almost certainly was taken when he was 15, and when he was 15 he stole some sneakers, and he has been, at the 18 years of age, he has now been convicted and sentenced to 5 years in an adult penitentiary. Manafort got a month less than 4 years. This black teenager got 5 years for stealing a pair of sneakers. If you think that's something totally disproportionate, you're right. Chelsea Manning used to be called Bradley Manning, and when she was a male, she was, I think, a lieutenant, but I'm not sure of his rank in the U.S. military. And he gave a film entitled Collateral Murder to WikiLeaks, which Julian Assange published on the WikiLeaks website, along with a whole host of other pieces of information about the Iraq War. Now, Chelsea underwent, or her name was Bradley at the time. Bradley Manning was, I keep going. When you go in a trial, he had his court-martial and was convicted of certainly revealing state secrets and possibly treason, but treason is one of the few crimes by which an individual can suffer the death penalty. So I think he was convicted of exposing or revealing state secrets. He was pardoned, or she was pardoned, because she had her sex change procedures while she was in prison. She was pardoned by Barack Obama, but all of the details of how she delivered the state secrets to WikiLeaks came out at her court-martial. That was approximately 4 years ago. I mean, anything that you wanted to learn about how she got the state secrets, how she transmitted them to WikiLeaks, etc., that all came out at her court-martial. She has been re-incarcerated, not because of anything she has done in the past, but because of what she's refusing to do in the prison. She's refusing to give testimony about all of the things that she did in the past, precisely because she disagrees with the
grand jury.
Grand jury, thank you, with the grand jury process. There's a statement or an aphorism among law scholars that a smart district attorney can get an indictment on a ham sandwich. And so Chelsea Manning doesn't want to give evidence. I will play this short clip where the newscasters are reporting on her incarceration.
All right, now to this. A former Army intelligence analyst, that is Chelsea Manning, she has been ordered to go to jail after refusing to testify before a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks. Manning says she objects to the secrecy of the grand jury process and that she already revealed everything she knows at her court-martial. The judge says Manning will remain jailed until she testifies or until the grand jury concludes its work. Back in 2010, Manning disclosed classified State Department information to WikiLeaks. She was released from a military prison 2 years ago.
Now, the question is, why does the grand jury that is attempting to get information on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange want to question Chelsea Manning? Everything that she knows came out 4 years ago. The presumption, like the charges against Attorney Cohen, Donald Trump's attorney, and against Paul Manafort, the presumption is that the attorney wants to establish a link suggesting that WikiLeaks and or Julian Assange helped Manning in the process of discovering and finding state secrets. In other words, they want to create a charge that they can level against Julian Assange and justify his arrest. There's no doubt in my mind that the same thing can be said about Mr. Cohen and Mr. Manafort. The goal there is to get witnesses to say things about Donald Trump that are either partially true or totally false, but with the intention of establishing a chargeable crime against Donald Trump himself. The only reason for putting Chelsea Manning in jail now is to get her to say something that she didn't say 4 years ago, and she said everything that there was to be said 4 years ago. This is an article demonstrating the mockery of civilian protections. We are protected theoretically by the Bill of Rights against providing evidence against ourselves. And yet, persons who are unconscious at the scene of an accident by law are interpreted as giving their consent for having their blood drawn, which is kind of about the same as declaring a corporation or declaring that money is speech. It's only informed consent by an unconscious individual by the vastest stretches of imagination, but it is the way of allowing the police to draw blood on an unconscious individual. What they are saying in this court decree, which has allowed state officers in a number of states to draw blood on an unconscious individual, is that by virtue of having a driver's license, you have given implicit consent. This is known as a contract of adhesion. You have given implicit consent to have the blood drawn by virtue of exercising your right to drive and using as a driver's license proof of your right to drive. If this seems like the legal equivalent of gerrymandering in order to establish a Republican or Democratic safe congressional district, I'd be very inclined to agree with you. We are looking at the manipulation of the law so that the government can accomplish what agents of the government want to accomplish. another instrument by which the government accomplishes what it wants to accomplish is a very good example, as a matter of fact, of a very bad use of a well-intended law. Back when we were actively engaged in a war on drugs, laws were passed permitting the police to seize and impound monies and items of value that were assumed to be the profits of drug interactions. And if you're talking about the manager or a money launderer of a drug cartel, that seems to make good sense, doesn't it? In point of fact, it has been abused by X number of state agencies, so that if I am traveling from Iowa to Texas, and I happen to have $3,000 in cash in hand because I am thinking of buying a car in Texas, and if I am stopped by a state trooper, which is much more likely if I am a young black man driving, let's say a Grand Am, that police officer stopping me has a perfect right to impound that $3,000. And it is legally possible, but practically impossible for me or that black young driver to regain control and possession of that money. And if the officer finds something that would be very useful in the police department, they have a very high propensity of saying, we think this was ill-gotten gains. Now, with that as background, I'm going to play, this is a 17-minute segment, and I won't play all of it, but this segment gives testimony by police officers, both on the appropriate use and the inappropriate use of this legislation, and testimony by people who have been victimized by it.
Sheriff's office, don't move. Get your hands out of your pocket now. Come on, I don't want to come in there. I don't want to shoot your dog.
Particularly in the rural areas, the counties are always having budget issues, and law enforcement has found that they can fund themselves using the state and federal forfeiture statutes.
In civil forfeiture, if the government thinks that your property is somehow connected with a crime, they can take it, and they can do all this without ever charging you with a crime, much less convicting you with one.
They made me feel like I was the criminal. I didn't do anything wrong. The people who used to fall victim to the asset forfeiture were the big drug kingpins.
Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted, and nearly $250 million of their assets were seized by the DEA.
It's not like that anymore. We now know in the United States the average amount seized is $800, and they're doing that off of millions of people.
They don't want to stop doing their forfeiture programs because they're making so much money. I'm just really surprised our government can get away with this.
As of right now, we're going to head over to the house that will be serving a search warrant. We know there's drug activity. We've done buys there, but 25 minutes ago we did a recon. We drove by. There are multiple people there, unknown exactly who everybody is. There are dogs there. Weapons, you never know. Meth, for sure. Pills, I mean, just you name it. Weed, it's probably going to be in there. So very, very likely that there will be cash also. At that point, everything gets seized and they'll file for forfeiture and it takes its legal course. So it's worth us taking the money because we're hurting them. By taking the money, we're hurting them. Why? Because at that point, they can't buy dope anymore. Sheriff's office, don't move. Get your hands out of your pocket.
And it's K9 Officer Tico.
What'd you find? Well, here, you gonna put that shit or what? No, I wanna find the meth first, I'm gonna collect everything. Well, there's a safe over here, I found the safe. Where's the safe? Oh, look at that. Bingo. I broke the code to the safe. What'd you get, meth? Bad money, too. Well, they're $5 grand, they're easy, no more.
We don't know a lot about forfeiture, and that's one of the real problems with it. We know that in the federal system, civil forfeiture is by far the most used form of forfeiture because it doesn't require a conviction. Criminal forfeiture, which does require a conviction, is only used about 13% of the time. It's 87% for the civil forfeiture. As anyone who's even seen a rerun of Law and Order knows how the criminal justice system is supposed to work. If the police think you committed a crime, they can arrest you, and then they have to take you to trial. And at that trial, you have the presumption of innocence. The government is supposed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the crime that they say you did. In civil forfeiture, if the government thinks that your property is somehow connected with a crime, they can take it, they can keep it, and in most instances, they get to keep 100% of it. And they can do all this without ever charging you with a crime, much less convicting you with one. And if you challenge them in court, most often you have to prove your own innocence in order to get your property back. And that turns what we know about constitutional protections on its head. The police and prosecutors have every incentive to seize your property and to try and keep it. Because in most states, they get to keep what they seize. It's a great way for law enforcement to get money, to keep money, and to create their own little slush funds free from the sort of oversight that ordinary political spending has.
That brings up an interesting topic. How do you decide forfeiture funds?
You know, it's usually based on a need. Well, I'll take that back.
Professional, I'd imagine you sign off on.
Yeah, there's some limitations on it. You know, actually it's not really on the forfeiture stuff. We just usually base it on something that would be nice to have, that we can't get in the budget for instance. You know, we try not to use it for things that we need to depend on, you know, because we need to go ahead and have those purchased. But it's kind of like pennies from heaven, you know, it gets you a toy or something that you need, is the way we typically look at it.
All across this country, they're attacking law enforcement on the way they use their RICO dollars. But it's only done so because some agencies have used those dollars inappropriately. The intent purpose is so that we can really impact the war on drugs. And if you're going to deal in drugs, I'm going to make it so it's not profitable for you. I'm going to take every last penny you have if you're dealing in drugs.
But it's a shame if they're using RICO dollars to fund their county. You can't just look at, yeah, look, I got overtime money. Or look, they paid 75% of my officer's salary. And so if the intent and purpose behind your RICO statutes is to take money so you can buy a desk, well, that's wrong. And I get it. Sometimes that's all the money they have. But yeah, you hear the stories that, oh, they seized this guy's car because he had a little baggie of marijuana personal use. Okay, I hope that's not what's happening. Does it happen? I think our agents have probably done something similar to that, where we've seized something and we probably shouldn't have.
My name's Barry Cooper. According to my bosses during an Associated Press interview, they claimed I was one of the top narcotics agents in the country at the time. I've worked joint operations and was cross-trained by the U.S. Border Patrol, U.S. military, FBI, U.S. Customs. Unfortunately, I'm responsible for arresting hundreds of citizens for nonviolent drug crimes, and during my tenure as a narcotics officer, I seized millions of dollars in cash and assets through civil forfeitures.
The driver and passenger stated that they don't know where this money came from, they don't want it, they don't want to have anything to do with it.
I remember showing my bosses that with my dog, the first money seizure I made paid for my salary, the fuel for the car, and everything for an entire year. They're like, man, this guy is on to something, and I made them rich.
We're out here looking for narcotics, large amounts of money, stolen property, and weapons. If you lies, we're gonna put you in jail, boy.
The most egregious thing I see about asset forfeiture is law enforcement's habit of manipulating the citizen out of their money by threatening an arrest if they answer the seizure papers. For example, when I was a police officer and we caught somebody with a large amount of money, whether it was drug money or not, we straight up told them on the side of the highway, we're not taking you to jail right now for money laundering, although we could. Within 30 days, you're going to get a letter in the mail saying you're being sued for this money because we think it's drug money. If you answer the charges and you fight for this money, then I'm going to come after you with an arrest warrant for money laundering, and we're going to arrest you, put you in jail. If you choose not to answer the civil paperwork, we will win the money in default, and you'll never hear from us again.
How much money you got? That's not yours, is it? Well, I'm seizing it.
A human burden of proof that's required is beyond a reasonable doubt because we're breathing and we're alive, and it takes more evidence, supposed to take more evidence to seize us and put us in a cage. But it takes half that evidence to seize property because it's not breathing, it doesn't have any civil rights. So it's seized based on what's called the preponderance of the evidence. If most of the evidence says it could be drug money, then it's going to be seized and it's going to be taken.
I think it's ludicrous. I mean, I want to know where the justice is here. I've given this country my 60 years of working. Now what more do you want?
I represent Mr. Wade and Ms. Chapman, who are currently charged with multiple felony offenses here in Arizona. They were arrested by the state police here because they were found to be growing 14 medical marijuana plants here in their property, in their garden. As a result, they currently are facing a mandatory prison sentence of 4 to 10 years if they're convicted of this offense. And they're also facing the seizure and forfeiture of Mr. Wade's home, 26 acres of property, all of their vehicles and other property, personal property that the police seized when they raided the home.
This is where the authorities came in. This is our garden down here. We had received a plant for Wendell's birthday, and so we planted it in this garden right here. And a concerned citizen called the police, and now we are probably going to lose this house that Wendell worked his whole life for, 60 years.
So we smoked a little weed. So what? You know? And now they want to take my property after busting my ass 60 years to get it? And they want to take it from me? If I'd have hurt somebody and done somebody, bad, I'd say, okay, I got the punishment coming, But I didn't. I didn't do nothing.
We have been offered 1 to 4 years probation, $25,000 fine, and 30 days in jail. But the other thing is, that still means that they can try and seize Wendell's property, no matter how that's resolved.
My Social Security is $1,031 a month. That's what I get. That's it. That'll be all the income that I'll have if they take my property from me. Can you even pay your rent on $1,000 a month? I can't pay rent on $1,000 a month. And so that'll leave me out on the street begging for somewhere to sleep.
Everybody in the county knows they're hard up for cash. They make no bones about it. And this, this is a real feather in their cap, I'm sure.
By the way, I want to point one thing out. If that were to come to trial, and if the defense attorney was sharp, he would insist on a jury trial of the gentleman's peers and make sure that the jury was informed about jury nullification. Because this is precisely the kind of issue that is appropriately subject to jury nullification, where the offense is clear, but the application of the law itself is unjust, and the jury has the power to nullify the unjust application of an unjust law. That's totally a different subject from what we are looking at this afternoon, but it's worth pointing out that jury nullification has a very important place in jurisprudence. It is totally anathema to the government's point of view, but it's very, very important for the individual property owner and person, that jury nullification is a protection against the unjust application of a law.
They made me feel like I was the criminal. I didn't do anything wrong, you know. I lent the car to my daughter to go to work, and I guess she was having problems, and she went to go get it fixed, and that's when all this happened. They took the car away from her. So I pick up the grandkids every day.
You hear some of these stories and they're horrifying. It's always claimed that these laws help fight the cartels, but these forfeitures are affecting not just cartels, they're affecting everyday people who are doing perfectly innocent things and are having their life savings taken, their homes taken, their cars taken, based on nothing that would ever stand up in court as them having been involved in any sort of criminal activity.
These are the papers they send us. There's only one that we understand is that if we want to give the car, just fill this out and put it in the envelope and send it in. You know, we're not lawyers, so they tell us that we have to get a lawyer to have them fill it out for us. One lawyer told me that the car wasn't, it would cost me more to pay him than to get the car back. And the person that brought us the subpoenas, he told us when we went downtown that the people would help us there. And they treated us like...
Yeah, we can't answer your questions, you just need to fill out the paperwork, or you need to get a lawyer. And it seems like they just want to take it from us. They don't want to give us a chance to get our vehicles back. The laws need to be changed, we need help here.
So not only is there a law that says no civil forfeiture, and is no municipality following the law, which has been recognized nationally as the gold standard of civil forfeiture reform, but we also have public officials who continue to enact new forfeiture ordinances and new forfeiture programs contrary to the law.
As a result of that, we teamed up together after the session was over and after the governor signed the bill in order to bring this lawsuit against the city of Albuquerque and get them to comply with the state law.
One of the big problems for us, and that Senator Ivy Soto and I have been personally facing, is that New Mexico is a very poor state. And so when this reform was passed, one of the reasons none of the municipalities have been following the new law is because they can't afford the hit in revenue. It is a tremendous amount of money. So then these police departments and the cities and the counties are going, where are we going to get all this money? Because they have some basic governmental needs that they have to take and that they have to take care of and they have to fund. So there's a huge problem because they have this money incentive, but we're a poor state and they need the money.
And it ends up being a backdoor tax on people who can't afford a lawyer.
Exactly.
So it's a backdoor tax on poor people.
So, one of the great things about forfeiture reform is that it can be a real bipartisan sort of
cross the political spectrum issue in an era where people are worried about increasing polarization. Nationwide, what we've seen is that really the only groups that have come out against these reform measures are law enforcement. They insist that nothing's wrong. They insist that they're doing good. They insist that we can trust them. And, a lot of places, law enforcement carries a big lobbying stick.
The point is made. And I appreciate him saying that it's law enforcement. It is basically the lower level institutions, the county, the city, sometimes the state, that is using this as a form of taxation, not unlike, frankly, the voluntary lottery. It's a form of taxation on the poor because the wealthy are not carrying their burden for the institutions we say they should be carrying. Now, almost all of what I have presented so far is demonstrating that the system is not broken, it is fixed, and it is fixed precisely to the detriment of the poor. I'm going to show you a video now, and some of you have seen it before, but it has something to say about the middle class as well as the poor, because we have been asleep at the wheel.
And they know a very interesting thing, which blows away all of our thinking, because we're still locked in the Henry Ford past of 100 years ago. We think that the CEOs of major companies, when they make products, right, that they will pay us a good amount so we can buy the products. They think we, the consumers, are part of something with that. We're not anymore. That's not how they think of it. That's not how they think of it, because they live in a world where they know that we are quite willing to redistribute massive amounts of wealth upwards. We don't object. We actually let them take immense amounts of money and, really kind of alter the whole economic structure. And we basically say, well, some of it will trickle down on us. And they know also that they can do global trade deals that literally take away our small d democratic rights to make fundamental decisions about the environment, about work life, about our communities, about almost everything that matters to us. And they know that by and large, even though we don't like it, we will elect people who tell us that they're going to make them better the next time. Yeah, NAFTA didn't work. Okay, China free trade will be better. Yeah, China free trade didn't work. Well, CAFTA will be better. Well, CAFTA didn't work. Well, the TPP will be better, right? It's always going to be, somehow it's going to work. And they know that somehow they keep doing, these CEOs know that keeps happening. And this is the thing they know, the biggest thing they know. We, the people, we like to eat. And some of us like to eat more than others, but we generally like to eat. And so they know that when they reduce the number of jobs, when they wipe out whole industries, we will not say, hold it, I object. Because we didn't object when they wiped out whole industries with their trade deals. We didn't object when they massively culled out our workforce. We haven't objected 40 years into stagnant wages. We haven't objected to the change from a situation where one person in a family could work while someone else stayed home with the kids, and while we had enough income to actually do all these things, and our kids could go to college, and instead of having massive debt that would last through the rest of their lives, it was actually something you could pay for with a part-time job. We didn't object to any of those changes. So why would they worry that when they take away massive numbers of jobs? Because they know that we will work harder. We will come earlier and stay later. We'll keep trying to cobble together an existence. I know this is going to sound crazy. They believe that we will take our private cars and troll around the streets of cities trying to pick people up and give them rides for a little bit of money, and will come some crazy German word like Uber or something like that. They believe that will happen. They believe we will get so desperate that we'll take rooms in our homes and rent them out and call it Airbnb. They believe correctly, that even as they cull out stable jobs that have real hours and schedules and benefits and enough pay to support people, they know that we'll just keep trying to cobble something together. And so they don't see this as some sort of bad calculus. They believe that there's a whole bunch more wealth to be redistributed upwards. And they also know something else. The last institutions that will ever talk about this in a serious way are those that make up our media. They know that our media will never, ever say, hold it, we're stopping this ridiculous conversation about Donald Trump's hands, because we can see in the foreseeable future Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, the top experts at Oxford, the people that really do work on this stuff are telling us we are within years of a progressively more jobless economy, and maybe that matters more than Donald Trump's hands, right? They know the media won't do that.
Mr. Nichols rightly points out that this is not only an assault on the poor, which several of the other videos I showed you demonstrate the assault on the poor. But Mr. Nichols points out that this is an assault on everybody but the top 10%. And the American people haven't yet noticed. Some of the people of France are now wearing yellow vests, and they've been in the streets every weekend for the last 12 weeks, objecting to the economic policies of Emmanuel Macron. And this same theme is being picked up in Italy. The Europeans are much more tuned in to cultural identity, so that if one Italian is being screwed, 10 other Italians will recognize that they are next in line. I apologize for the coarseness of my language, but nevertheless, this is what's called neoliberal economics, that is a progressive funneling of money up toward the very wealthy. A friend of mine asked me a few days ago why I seemed to favor both Venezuela and Russia in terms of our several political discussions. And I pointed out what the Russian government is attempting to do on behalf of the Russian people, and what the Venezuelan government under Mr. Maduro is attempting to do on behalf of the Venezuelan people. Then I pointed out what is happening in any of a number of countries that are vassal states of the wealthy in the United States. I picked out just one. In Haiti, there is a ruling wealthy class of about 2% of the population. The vast majority of them are white. The vast majority of them vacation in Paris or in England or in Miami Beach. And all of the economic policies that the Haitian government promotes are economic policies that enrich American corporations and that 2% of the wealthy Haitians. The Haitian government is doing what is good for the Haitian wealthy. The American government is doing what is good for the American wealthy. Now, Mr. Nichols includes corporations in this. I've quite intentionally not made any distinction between governmental policies, such as the policy of civil forfeiture, and corporate policy, such as the laying off of huge numbers of people and the buying of robots to do the work of those people. It is the same policy of redistributing wealth upward rather than distributing it downward. And a stable society will not survive with the continual upstream movement of that wealth. So I'm glad that Mr. Nichols is pointing out that corporations are doing it, and the government also is doing it. The Italians and the French are waking up. I don't know when the Americans are going to wake up, or if they're going to wake up. This video is concerning a few of the white-collar crimes
with the infamous Enron scandal. And here's what I'm guessing most people know about it. The company cooked the books and pulled off some shady accounting tricks. They were caught and now cease to exist as a result. But this is a very thin understanding of the subject. There was so much stuff that went down, I can't even do it justice in a short video like this. If you want to become an expert on it, there's a movie I can recommend. It's called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. It's nearly 2 hours about the scandal, and honestly, I think that's even rushing it. The entire ordeal is so complicated that there can easily be an entire college course centered around it, and that course would be for the advanced students. Wouldn't it be great if someone created a YouTube video that concisely explained it in a way that's both entertaining and easy to understand? Enron formed through a merger in 1985 between two energy companies. That's what Enron was, by the way, an energy company. When I say that, it's a huge simplification because Enron was involved in so many things in complex ways that the average person didn't even come close to understanding exactly what the company did. It was founded by a man named Ken Lay. You may want to remember that name. Now let's fast forward around to the year 2000. It was a fantastic company and very attractive for investors. At the time, they were thought of as being one of the world's leaders in business. I would say it's like how we view companies like Apple and Google today, but that's not even close to how amazing Enron was. They were making money and growing at a rate that no one had ever seen before. So here, I'll pretend to be a financial advisor helping you decide which stock you may want to buy. Here we go. I've looked over all the numbers, and I strongly advise you to invest in Enron. They're one of the fastest growing and most respected companies around today. I'll just show you a few numbers to support my advice. As a financial advisor, I look at companies' revenue, debt, and past stock trends. Here's Enron's revenue over the past 5 years. Just look at that growth. It's quicker than I've ever seen. I also checked out their debt, and it's very reasonable compared to their equity, meaning they're in great standing with creditors and have very little chance of going bankrupt. And as far as stock trends, here's a graph showing the stock price over the past few years. Just 3 years ago, they were in the $20 range. Today, it's well above $80. I've been advising clients to purchase this for some time now, and I've yet to have someone disappointed by their decision, except one guy who decided against it, and he's kicking himself right now. Plus, while I was reviewing their year 2000 annual report, it was filled with statements straight from Enron themselves saying how they're expecting future growth and success in the future. So Enron is well respected, has incredible revenue growth, low debt, and a solid history of unheard stock growth. So what do you think? Do you want to invest in Enron? Okay, I'm done being the advisor right now. Since I couldn't hear your answer, I'll assume you said yes, you want to invest in Enron. And if you said no, that's a foolish answer at the time. Based on the information available, practically anyone who knew anything about the stock market would say to jump on it. So now you've invested heavily in Enron. Now let's fast forward 1 year and see how you did. So it turns out the stock didn't go up like everyone had projected. In fact, it's gone down just a tad. What was in the $80 range when you invested is now in the 50 to 60 cent range. So you've effectively lost all your money. I'm making light of it here, but there were thousands of people that experienced this, including the Enron employees. They invested heavily in 401ks and retirement plans that were tied up in Enron stock. And really, can you blame them? But Enron went bankrupt in December of 2001. Thousands of people lost their jobs, retirement funds, and any other money they had invested in Enron. So what happened between this year and the last? As it turns out, all these numbers I just showed you were just an illusion. Back when I was your financial advisor, I was advising you based on false numbers. Take the revenue I just showed you. It's all fake. How so? Here's what Enron did to make it appear so high. It's thanks to something called mark-to-market accounting. Its effect is basically being able to recognize revenue when you have no revenue. Here's an example of something that actually happened with Enron. In 2000, they signed a 20-year contract with Blockbuster. Enron thought the contract would result in profits in excess of $100 million. So only 3 more years and the contract between Enron and Blockbuster will be expired. Well, obviously the contract didn't work out, and was actually doomed from the start. It had to do with bandwidth and internet streaming, but the technology didn't work and Blockbuster ended the contract. Here's the problem. Enron recognized over $100 million in revenue from the deal. It doesn't quite seem like they earned $100 million in revenue from the deal, yet they reported $100 million in revenue from the deal. Then, as an advisor, I looked at that number to tell you that you should buy Enron, and they did this far more than just the Blockbuster contract. All they had to do was project some earnings, and boom, they had earnings. It essentially allowed them to put any number they wanted in that earnings column. Another thing I looked at when advising to buy the stock was their liabilities. Well, as you may have guessed, their liabilities were completely false as well. How they pulled this one off is a little more complicated. But in short, they set up side companies and pushed the debt over to them. So all of a sudden, Enron's debt problem was solved. Obviously they still had the debt, but it was no longer on their financial reports, and therefore non-existent as far as investors can tell. I also looked at the stock trends. These high stock prices were a result of investors being fooled by these numbers for an extended period of time. So the stock was trading for over $80 per share, whereas if the company hadn't pulled these accounting tricks, it would have been trading for a fraction of that. There were numerous other accounting frauds committed, but these were the biggest and most impactful. But there's another part to this. What about the auditors? The job of an auditor is to look over all these financial statements to ensure the company's position is fairly represented. Every public company legally has to have their financial statements audited. The primary purpose of an auditor is to prevent things like this from happening, so the investors can confidently use the reports to make informative decisions. Had the auditors done their job properly, they would have seen red flags all over the place. But they weren't doing their job properly. They weren't really doing it at all. They were being paid by Enron to look the other way. The name of these auditors? Arthur Andersen. At the time, there were 5 major accounting firms: Deloitte, KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, and Arthur Andersen. Almost all major companies would use one of these accounting firms to audit their financial statements. Now it's down to 4 major accounting firms because Arthur Andersen didn't survive this scandal. See, an auditor survives by their reputation. When investors see that PwC audited a set of statements, they trust that they're accurate. But now, if Arthur Andersen audits something, the investors are still questioning whether or not it's accurate, which makes investors avoid the company. So all of Arthur Andersen's customers switched over to one of the other 4 firms. The auditors didn't do their job in detecting it. But who's responsible for the fraud on Enron's end? 2 executives from the company are pretty heavily blamed: Ken Lay, who I mentioned earlier, and Jeff Skilling. They were both found guilty of conspiracy and fraud, among other things. Skilling is set to be released in February of 2019, and Ken Lay is dead. He died of a heart attack in the time between the verdict and the sentencing in 2006. He was 64 years old. There were several other people involved in the scandal, many of which walked away with millions of dollars and sold their stock right before the massive drop. This scandal, along with others like it at the time, promoted a new set of accounting rules that dramatically changed the accounting industry, because it clearly wasn't functioning perfectly. Now auditors have much stricter independence rules. Also, the CEO and the CFO have to certify the financial statements, so they can't later on deny that they ever saw them, which happened with Enron.
On the date I left, I absolutely unequivocally thought the company was in good shape.
Again, this was just a brief review of the scandal. Some of the things I didn't cover include intentionally causing power outages in California, Ken Lay's ties to former President George W. Bush, Enron's involvement with the election of former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, how everything was ultimately revealed, and much more detail about the individuals responsible and how much they profited from the whole scandal. If you want to hear more...
I'm going to stop that there because there are a couple other things I want to cover. But you get the idea that basically Enron ran a scam that the leading officers knew was a scam. It actually corresponds very well with what Bill Black says as a recipe for huge profits, driving up your stock price, and getting out just before the crash. Now, these two officers of Enron were convicted of criminal fraud, but there were a whole host of people in the upper echelons of administration that sold their stock before the crash. The people who worked for Enron had to have their 401ks invested in Enron, and they were prohibited from selling their stock. So the people with white shirts and $500 shoes made a lot of money. But the people who worked for Enron and the people who invested in Enron, especially in their 401ks, they were the ones who lost big time. I asked shortly after this event a person knowledgeable in accounting whether there was any reliable way of being sure that a corporation or company was in fact in as good financial situation as their paperwork looked. He gave me a long answer and he gave me a short answer, and the short answer to my question was no. There are simply too many ways of hiding liabilities and inflating assets so that you cannot tell. Brooksley Born, I'm going to show just a short segment of it. Brooksley Born attempted to control the over-the-counter derivatives market. This was toward the end of Bill Clinton's administration, and Brooksley Born had the authority to control these opaque financial instruments. 3 people in Clinton's government said, "Oh no!" One of them was Larry Summers. Another was Alan Greenspan. And the third one, whose name slips my mind, we may be able to see, but he's the one who is very penitent about having prevented Brooksley Born from doing what she knew was her job to do. Let's see if I can find a few of the segments involved. You're not going to show much of this because this is worth a segment all of its own.
Times were good. Alan Greenspan ruled the economy.
When you can get a 3.7% yield with upside, that's a lot better than getting 3.7% yield.
Washington's hands-off attitude toward Wall Street seemed to be paying off.
So now it's all systems go between now and then.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was time for a celebration.
The Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Alan Greenspan is one of the most admired and influential economists in our nation's history.
The nation's highest civilian honor was bestowed on the man many called the Wizard.
More than one story was written about Alan Greenspan as the Wizard, the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz.
Alan was a great wizard. No one understood what he said. He said it in such a way that everybody bought it.
What's going to happen when all of this stimulation starts to decline?
Everybody hung on every word. Congressman, it depends on what is going on in the world generally.
The Wizard, the man behind the curtain who mumbled in ways that ordinary people couldn't understand, but who appeared to be controlling absolutely everything.
Then we're going to get an exceptionally large amount of fiscal stimulus, which we're not going to want. Very few people wanted to take him on or challenge him because he knew so much more than they did, and if he didn't, he certainly appeared to.
In his 18 years as Fed chairman, he applied those
5 presidents had watched Alan Greenspan work his magic. It started back in the Ford administration.
Alan Greenspan was a financial consultant who was hired by Jerry Ford, first to be head of his Council of Economic Advisors in the 70s.
But Alan Greenspan was not your stereotypical economist.
He was also very charming and a man about Washington.
He played jazz clarinet and made himself rich on Wall Street. And he had embraced an unusual political guru,
the moral code of altruism.
the libertarian philosopher Ayn Rand.
Everybody is enslaved to everybody.
Greenspan is a disciple. She is the great champion of government as a destructive force that just gets in the way.
This is very important in and of itself, but I want to get just a short segment on Brooksley.
A man in the class saying, "What are you doing here? You're taking the place of..."
There's Brooksley. Okay.
Almost right away, she had one. It began after she received an invitation to lunch at the Federal Reserve with the chairman himself.
How could you not have a little bit of butterflies in your stomach when you're going to go see Alan Greenspan at that moment in time?
It didn't take long for Bourne to learn that she and the chairman were not going to see eye to eye.
He said something to the effect of, well, Brooksley, we're never going to agree on fraud. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you probably think there should be rules against it. And she said, well, yes, I do. He said, you know, I think the market will figure it out and take care of the fraudsters.
The Alan Greenspan lunch, did it actually happen? Where he says...
I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it on camera.
Bourne is reluctant to speak about her meetings with Greenspan or others in the Clinton administration. Greenspan refused to speak to Frontline at all, but Bourne's advisors did.
Greenspan didn't believe that fraud was something that needed to be enforced, and he assumed she probably did. And of course she did. I've never met a financial regulator who didn't feel that fraud was part of their mission.
And this is an absolute stunner for the new head of this tiny agency, who is charged with making sure people don't commit fraud.
Well, I think she was taken aback about how far he would go towards deregulation, that even the notion that we should police fraudulent activity, he didn't think was something that was a given.
Because of time constraints, I'm going to stop this here. This is downloadable. It's a Frontline presentation. All you need to do is Google Brooksley Bourne and Frontline, and you will be able to see the entire production. And basically, Brooksley did everything she could to protect the small and medium-sized investor. And what we saw earlier with respect to Enron was clearly fraud. There are multiple avenues for committing fraud on Wall Street. There is a video that I'm not going to show you. The newest way of committing fraud is by not publicizing the benefit packages that the CEOs of corporations have. Those benefit packages are liabilities for the corporation. And because they are liabilities for the corporation, they should go in the debit column of their balance sheet. If you exclude those benefits from your balance sheet, you make your corporation look a great deal more solvent than it actually is. That's the newest form of fraud. But unfortunately, fraud is endemic both in the upper levels of government and in the upper levels of corporate management, not the lower levels. We've had this discussion in the class before. In Egypt and Middle Eastern countries, fraud and bribery is a small business whereby small level bureaucrats augment their salaries. In the United States and in Western Europe generally, but especially in the United States, fraud takes place not at the lower levels, but at the uppermost levels. I'll remind you of the statement that Larry Summers made to Elizabeth Warren when she was first getting her feet wet in Washington. He said to Elizabeth, "Elizabeth, you can do one of two things. You can be an insider and have your opinions listened to and sometimes followed, or you can be an outsider and say anything you want to and not be heard." But one thing you have to know about insiders: insiders do not criticize insiders. Now, Larry Summers eminently deserved to be criticized, as the Brooksley Born episode demonstrates. But if you are working amidst fraudsters, you don't criticize your fellow fraudsters. I'm going to play this because it's not all that long. It's 12 minutes, and I'm going to abuse you to this extent, because the most potentially constructive activity in terms of opposition now, I believe, happens to be Represent.us. They are attempting to create anti-corruption laws in all of the 50 states and use the 50 states as the leverage to get a national anti-corruption law that has real teeth to it. Will they succeed? That depends entirely on the American public.
We are witnessing a total political system failure in America. If you're anything like me, you may find yourself constantly overwhelmed by everything that's wrong with politics. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans. I'm talking about the flaws that exist in our political system, regardless of which party is in power. And I know it's hard to talk about politics these days, but look, the government is ours. We pay for it, so it needs to work for us. And right now it doesn't, and I mean it really doesn't. So what's going on here? Is it Russian meddling in social media? Is it him? Is it her? No. Those two were the least popular presidential candidates since they began keeping track of such things. Only 4% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in Congress now. Just 4%. America is no longer even considered a full democracy. We are witnessing a total political system failure in America, which is the complete opposite of what our nation's founders had in mind. So I'm going to show you 3 lines that show what's causing this failure, how we can fix it, and what you can do about it. So here's your first line. What I want you to do is take any issue you really care about and picture it on this line. This line comes from a Princeton University study that shows how public opinion influences the laws that Congress does or doesn't pass. They looked at 1,800 public opinion polls over a 20-year period, and we took their data and plotted it in this chart. See this horizontal line? That shows public support for a law amongst average Americans. This vertical line? That shows the likelihood of the public support leading to the passage of a law. When you plot it for the average American, you get a line that looks like this. There's your issue sitting on that line. If there is 0 support for a law, there's about a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. And if there is 100% support for something, the most popular thing ever, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. So the line is horizontal because no matter how much support there is among average Americans, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass that law. Princeton determined that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. How in the hell does that happen? Consider this. Politicians are spending up to 70% of their time raising funds for re-election after they get into office. Why? Because in order to win a seat in the Senate in some races, you would have to raise $45,000 every single day, 365 days a year for 6 years to raise enough money to win. Now consider that only 0.05% of Americans give more than $10,000 to politics. And then you see why politicians have become completely dependent on the 0.05% of Americans, billionaires and special interest groups, who fund their campaigns. Meanwhile, you've got lobbyists writing our laws and donating to the politicians who pass them. We have a two-party duopoly of Democrats and Republicans that makes it so that independents can't win, while the American people are leaving the major parties in droves. As you can see here, nearly half of American voters are now registered independent. And then there's gerrymandering, with politicians drawing the boundaries of their own voting districts into crazy shapes designed to prevent competition. Today, only 14% of House campaigns are actually competitive. 86% of them are not. And we wonder why young people feel that their vote doesn't matter. I've covered a lot here, but it all adds up to this vast ring of influence over our elected leaders. It's a corrupt system in which we, the people, have near zero influence over our own government. And that is sad. That is not the country I feel like I grew up in. But what's worse is that by allowing this to happen, we are causing the failure of the most important issues facing our nation. We're wasting trillions of dollars a year on fraud and abuse in our own government. 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. Our healthcare is the most expensive in the world. We have more people in prison per capita than Russia and China. We're losing jobs to the rest of the world, and we're not even doing enough to keep our air and our water clean for our children. America was founded on the promise of self-governance, but instead we have statistically non-significant impact on public policy. So the question is, how do we unrig this system? I'm obsessed with this idea, not just of unrigging it, but actually fixing it. That's when I met Josh.
This is it. This is the issue behind the issues. If we fix the system, we'll have so much more power to fix everything else. So I spoke to some of the most brilliant people in the country. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Lessig, Zephyr Teachout, and dozens of other constitutional scholars and experts and strategists. They all said the same thing. You could pass a law that would stop political bribery and fix our broken elections. And if you could do that, you could wrest power away from the corrupt establishment and put it back in the hands of the people. Here's how you fix our broken elections. End gerrymandering with independent redistricting commissions.
Create ranked choice voting so third parties and independents can run and win.
Implement automatic voter registration and vote from home.
And here's how we can crack down on political bribery. Overhaul lobbying and ethics laws and close the revolving door so politicians can't be bribed with high-paying job offers.
Mandate full transparency of political spending so we know who's trying to buy influence.
Give every voter a $50 or $100 tax voucher so politicians spend time fundraising from their constituents, not just that 0.05% that I talked about earlier.
If you could pass even just some of these reforms, you would undo that ring of influence and begin to reinstate we the people as the most important influence over our elected leaders. So we took all of these reforms and put them in a model law and named it the Anti-Corruption Act. And get this, 87% of Americans support making the Anti-Corruption Act the law of the land. Look at the breakdown. 91% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans. It's incredible. Now you might be thinking 9 out of 10 Americans. Surely Congress will pass it. But on this issue, more than any other issue, it's like asking the fox to put a lock on the henhouse. Politicians won in the current system, and they have an incentive not to fix it. So we need to go around Congress, in this case, by passing anti-corruption acts in cities and states all across America. Now, every time I say this, people look at me and say, how does passing city and state laws lead to fixing all of these problems with the federal government?
Can I do this part?
Go for it.
So, first of all, the U.S. Constitution gives states sole control over how elections are run, even federal elections. So when we fix gerrymandering or election laws, that fixes a federal election in each state. That means that by going state by state, we have an immediate impact on how we elect Congress and how we hold them accountable. But there's more, and that brings us to our second line. This line is from a Bloomberg News study. It finds that throughout American history, passing state laws leads to federal victory. Let me show you what I mean. This chart shows the number of states over time that pass laws giving women the right to vote. When it hits the right side of the chart, that's the federal victory. Okay, now I want you to watch the blue line. We're gonna do this again with interracial marriage. There were a few states in the Northeast that made it legal decades ago, and centuries go by, and we hit this blue line where all of a sudden there's a rush of activity, which leads pretty quickly to federal passage. So here we are again with same-sex marriage. One state, Massachusetts, for many years. A couple decades later, we hit that blue line, a jump in state activity and federal passage. This isn't about these issues. This is about a winning political strategy. The crucial finding in the Bloomberg study is that a key event, often a court decision or a grassroots campaign reaching maturity, triggers a rush of state activity that ultimately leads to a change in federal law. So fixing this problem is possible, but how do we create our trigger moment for this issue? Well, the grassroots campaign from the study, that's Represent Us. We're bringing conservatives and progressives together to pass anti-corruption laws all across America using 3 strategic innovations: right-left coalitions, calling out corruption, and building a movement, a big movement. And I'm gonna break them down for you.
Can I do this part?
No. First, right-left. This is how people self-identify in America. This isn't party identification. This is how you feel politically. And as you can see, it's 25% liberal, 36% conservative, and 34% moderate.
I'm going to stop this here out of, frankly, courtesy to your time, because you've seen one other video from the Represent.us folk. And my reason for being somewhat hopeful about this is that the process of the states enacting the legislation and therefore creating a mass movement, basically forcing the federal government to follow suit, has merit. There are some major obstacles, enforcement being one of them, because there are many laws against white-collar corruption. Bill Black demonstrates that white-collar corruption during the during the savings and loan crisis led to the prosecution of 100 individuals. The financial crisis of 2008-9 led to the prosecution of exactly 0 individuals. So you need to create a situation where there is an incentive to prosecute wrongdoing. So there is a major hurdle there. But it is an effective way of a grassroots movement making the federal government look stupid if 35 or 40 states pass local anti-corruption laws and this federal government doesn't follow suit. I appreciate your attention. We're going to come back to this issue of corruption on numerous occasions, so I'll tell you good afternoon for this occasion. Thank you.